Good. I guess he's now recording. Tom,
Great.
yeah, you can go ahead. Yep.
Great. Thank you, Marco. Welcome, everyone. This is the latest talk in the series held by Loughborough University Nationalism Network and the penultimate one for the year. So thank you for all those that are joining us and for those that are going to be joining. My name is Tom Bennett. I'm a doctoral researcher and chair for today's talk from Dr. Amy Clarke. Just a reminder that this talk is recorded. Please keep your microphones off and your videos off when Amy is presenting. When it comes to questions, please avoid using the chat window and turn your camera on, raise a hand, and we can respond to questions accordingly as and when we get to them. We usually try and group them to save time. The talk will be approximately 35 minutes with whatever time is left for questions. So we'll try and aim promptly for 5, if not a little bit before. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Amy Clarke. She's a lecturer in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Brighton University. She has a broad interest in questions around identity, belonging, and race, particularly in relation to the nation, and has published across disciplines of geography, sociology, and migration studies. Today, Amy is here talking to us about her research on hierarchies, scale, and privilege, unpicking white middle-class construction. So once again, final reminder, just turn your microphones off, turn your cameras off. Amy, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to Marco for inviting me. As Tom said, my name is Amy Clarke. I'm a lecturer in sociology at the University of Brighton. I've been working on a range of different topics, but today I'm going to be presenting kind of an overview of my primary research area, drawing on work that I conducted for my PhD and kind of subsequent publications from that work. So, by way of a brief introduction, my research has looked at understandings of national identity and belonging among white middle-class British people, with the central aim of understanding the ways that these people imagine, produce and maintain boundaries of belonging between a national us and a non-national other, as well as hierarchies within Britain's national community. Let me just change that slide. So a few months after I finished my fieldwork, Britain voted to leave the European Union. And I think that time really highlighted the significance and ongoing relevance of the boundaries and hierarchies that I'm going to be talking about today. So not only was the construction of the electorate itself revealing of who was considered entitled to have a say in the future of the country, but the campaigns, debates and vote to leave revealed the way that Britain's citizens and residents were differently positioned within a hierarchy of belonging, with some people understood to belong more or more rightfully than others. The national we that was articulated by the campaigns and illustrated here by Nigel Farage was often exclusive and possessive. And when the results were in, a rise in hate crime against EU, non-EU and British people of colour revealed the extent to which Brexit had, for many people, been about much more than the European Union. As many scholars have since argued, Brexit was also about re-establishing Britain and Britishness as belonging to some people more than others, highlighting the ways in which, to use Scourby et al.'s phrasing, an assertion of belonging by one group can simultaneously exclude another. So in this sense, Brexit, like political events that have happened before and since, for example, the Windrush scandal and the Shamima Begum case, have revealed powerful symbolic boundaries that surround the nation, as well as hierarchies of belonging embedded within it. Of course, these situations aren't new, and empirical research has repeatedly demonstrated that ethnically and religiously minoritized Britain's experiences of national belonging have been and continue to be undermined by cultural exclusion and institutional racism across different scales, from the micropolitics of interaction to national level law and policy. So, of course, thinking about why does it matter? The nation isn't everything, and identity certainly isn't the be all and end all. But identity and recognition do matter for people's psychosocial well-being. And we also know that identities and symbolic boundaries have and continue to translate into real differences in terms of power, opportunity, and people's access to and control over resources. Moreover, insofar as those excluded from the national community cannot participate in national social life on equal terms, I'd say that national belonging represents an important part of the lived experience of social inclusion. And as long as ethnically and religiously minoritised Britons narrate exclusion from the nation, the type of narrative depicted on the slide here, we as academics should be working to understand and unpick that exclusion. So as I said, there's plenty of empirical research demonstrating exclusion and marginalisation of minoritised Britons in relation to boundaries of belonging. And it was this literature, alongside a growing personal frustration with public and political agendas that place responsibility for integration and belonging on migrants and minorities, while overlooking racism and structures of exclusion, that led me in to do the kind of research that I ended up doing. So at that time, which is around 10 years ago now, I perceived a gap in the literature around the role of more privileged belongers within processes of national belonging, and wanted to shed light on the fact that, as Jed Boardman puts it, someone or something is doing the exclusion. Okay, so in terms of a theoretical framework, my work builds on that of Yuval Davis in particular, and the way that she highlights the political and relational nature of belonging. So while identification and attachment matter, this work shows that belonging also needs to be recognised by those who belong to the group, and to a lesser extent by external others. Belonging is, in other words, as much about being recognised as belonging as it is about self-identification, and a substantive sense of belonging requires recognition in the eyes of existing members. So in her work on the politics of belonging, Yuval Davis explains that belonging involves active and ongoing processes of boundary making and shaping that operate within frameworks of power. These processes work to separate an us from them and involve the inclusion or exclusion of particular people by those who have the power. Yet despite their central role in processes and politics of belonging, there's surprisingly little empirical research documenting the ways that dominant groups who have such power produce and maintain boundaries of belonging. So focusing in on this question of power, I wanted to focus on the role of Britain's white ethnic majority in producing and maintaining boundaries, but also producing or reworking hierarchies of national belonging. So I look at boundaries as well as hierarchies, because while boundaries are part of the picture, as Floya Antheus notes, it's also about the hierarchies that exist within and across boundaries. So boundaries are formed through processes of differentiation and constitute kind of horizontal lines of separation or contact, whereas hierarchies divide vertically through processes of stratification. And in my work, I talk about how the point at which the two intersect is where difference comes to be organised hierarchically, and it's therefore really important to think about both of those things together. Thinking about boundaries and hierarchies also helps to draw attention to the complexity of belonging. In particular, it becomes possible when you're looking at both of those things to take seriously the possibility of differential inclusion within Britishness, and the fact that nationhood is not necessarily an either or, and that some British people might be considered more or less British than others. These two things are working together. And this more complex picture is vital in plural and post-colonial societies like the UK, where people who are marginalised within hierarchies of belonging often include, formal citizens and people who in certain spaces and times might be constructed as belonging. So as I said, my research is focused on the role of Britain's white middle classes, and this is built around an understanding of this group as heterogeneous, but a group who share a relatively privileged sense of belonging in Britain. While not necessarily privileged in all ways, all spaces and all times, Britain's white middle classes enjoy a relatively easy and assumed belonging in Britain, and their sense of belonging is routinely validated in everyday economies of recognition. As Michael Skay explains, they are, broadly speaking, people whose national identity is taken for granted and unquestioned, and for whom Britain is generally experienced as, to quote, a homely place that is both comfortable and familiar. There are obviously times and spaces where the picture is more complicated and ambiguous for certain groups and individuals, but in general it's this idea of the taken for granted and unquestioned nature of their belonging that kind of draws them together as a group. So bringing all of this together, I arrived at my kind of overall research questions, which were intended to answer the overall question of what possibilities exist for migrants and racialised Britons to be included as full and substantive members of the national community within white middle class imaginings. And so I broke this down to look kind of separately at how white middle class British people imagine the nation, how they understand and recognise other people as British or not, and how they position differently racialised people in relation to these boundaries and hierarchies. So hopefully I've made clear already, but my decision to focus on white British middle classes was not about ignoring or belittling the agency of migrants or racialised minorities, or even to suggest that everyone in Britain should feel or want to feel British. Rather, the intention was really about shedding discourses work to produce and sustain constructions of belonging that are exclusive and or inclusive in different ways, with the aim of unpicking some of those power-laden processes of belonging. Okay, I'm not going to spend much time talking about methods, but to give you a brief overview, my research was conducted between 2015 and 2016 in the suburbs of North East London and West Essex. And I did multiple interviews with 26 people who were between 32 and 75 and all broadly recognisable as white and middle class. They all had British citizenship from birth and identified, albeit variously and with differing intensity, with Britishness and or Englishness. So over the interviews, I did 2 to 3 interviews with everyone. I chatted generally with participants about their local area and changes there, as well as their identifications, views on migration and integration, and their kind of ideas about Britishness and Englishness. This work has led to 5 papers so far, 4 of which are published, and one's I've just got to do some minor revisions, but will hopefully be published soon-ish. So in the time I've got left, I'm going to try and give you a bit of a taster of a few of those articles, but focusing mainly on that one that's highlighted there, which was published in Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers, and outlines 3 discursive constructions of belonging that I came across. And these constructions of belonging are for us to, as researchers, to think about the diversity of belongings that exist. They're not necessarily the only ways that you can belong in Britain, and then participants didn't kind of all talk about all 3 of these things or talk about them equally. They were variously deployed, even by the same individuals, in a way that actually kind of highlighted some of the discursive power of white middle class people I was talking to. Okay, so those are the 3 things. So the first construction of belonging that I write about, I call belonging in, and that was characterised by local level involvement, interaction, and a sense of an individual group fitting in locally. It was used mainly in relation to migrants and shares many characteristics with dominant understandings of integration. So participants' narratives often revealed the inclusion of migrant and ethnically minoritised Britons within kind of local areas and landscapes. In the top quote there, for example, Jane explains how local people from a range of ethno-national backgrounds had become integral to her sense of place of belonging through the repeated unfolding of actions over time. Talking about friendly people in the Chinese round the corner and Mr. Chopra in the newsagent where they got their papers. And these different ethno-national backgrounds didn't make people any less part of the local area. Being seen as integrated and being seen as part of local communities and landscapes also didn't mean that they ceased to be seen in relation to ethno-national categories. So they could be seen as belonging and integrated, but also as ethno-nationally different in some way. Similarly, for Kate, being Asian or Polish in the quote on the slide also didn't denote being out of place in any way or negate a sense of local belonging. And her comment kind of indicates the significance of fitting in with ideas of place and complying with local schemes of order. So the importance of local engagement to recognition of belonging in Britain was also evident in participants' explicit assertions about migrant belonging. And here Linda talks about how her husband's belonging through local knowledge, involvement, care and commitment to local places. With belonging perceived in this way, it was entirely possible for migrants like Linda's husband to be recognised as belonging in and to local communities and landscapes, and by extension, I'd say as belonging in Britain as a place. And while this kind of belonging does not require recognition of someone as being British, it's also unable to guarantee or produce it, showing how the possibility of belonging in Britain within its kind of territory and society, that's possible without being seen as British or as belonging to Britain. And this difference between belonging in Britain and belonging to Britain was also evident in examples where people undermined migrants' belonging to the nation, even where they were accepting them as belonging there. So in the top quote there, for example, talking about someone whose father was Greek, Oliver shows kind of surprise where he refers to we as being England. So he meant England, which was quite interesting, but he'd been here a while. And then Rick there talks about a Scottish rugby player who apparently said something like, oh, I've been here for 3 years now and my daughter's been born. I live in Glasgow or Edinburgh and my daughter's been born here, so I don't think I could be any more Scottish. And Rick sort of says, really, in a questioning that he would consider himself Scottish, let alone British. So to summarise this kind of section, despite the possibilities it provides, belonging in Britain, which was usually articulated in relation to a good or integrated migrant, did not guarantee recognition of someone being British or as belonging to Britain in the eyes of white British participants. Indeed, as these comments have shown, even when positioned firmly within British places and landscapes and as part of Britain's and as part of British society, integrated migrants remain exogenous to the nation, and there's a limited potential for local belonging as a mode of national belonging. The second construction of belonging was belonging to Britain in the sense of being British. And several participants emphasised the open and inclusive nature of Britishness to me, many suggesting that it was actually relatively easy to become British. But despite those assertions, the possibilities for migrants to be recognised as belonging to the national community were limited and were usually based on ideas of shared culture and upbringing, and often with underlying assumptions that those things would tally with formal citizenship. So several participants suggested, more or less explicitly, that while immigrants could integrate into British society, actually being British in the sense of belonging to the national community required someone to be born and bred in Britain. Phil, who I've got a quote on the slide, for example, seemed to imply a distinction between being integrated and being British, and he reverted back to talk about integration when I asked about possibilities for becoming British. So I've put in bold there the bit I'm about to talk about, but I've sort of probed further as to whether he thought there was a difference between being integrated and being part of the nation, at which point he sort of said, I think you've put your finger on it there. You know, integration is one thing, but actually being British because you've grown up with it, I think that's something much deeper that perhaps takes a generation or two. And like others, Phil understood national identity as developing through a person's embeddedness in a common culture. And this made it hard for him to recognise people who had migrated to the UK as adults as British, even though he sort of at the same time said that that was how he felt. While it was not necessarily how Phil thought things should be, it was his kind of a practical understanding of nationhood, and one that also matched with his own experiences of migration. He'd spent some time living in Latvia. In suggesting that being a national required a common cultural upbringing moulded through being brought up in a place, Phil recognised the limited potential that migrants have for being British. Although he acknowledged their ability to integrate and belong in society, nationhood was something that he kind of saw as less transferable. Other people made similar comments, and sorry, that's quite a long quote there, but Ross described the impossibility of becoming somebody of a country if you were not raised there. And he concluded that to some extent you can adopt the values of another country, but you'll never be the same as someone who's been born and brought up in that country. This was quite a common type of distinction. So in theory, the importance of culture and upbringing to participants' accounts of national belonging and belonging to Britain enables the inclusion of British people of colour and anyone who migrated as a child or a young child as part of the nation, not just part of society. Within this, it was notable that the accents of British people of colour were often mentioned as a way to evidence their upbringing and therefore to legitimise them and their Britishness. And that shows the power of accents as a marker that supposedly signals where someone grew up, because that was kind of what it was taken to imply. However, in practice, I found that national capitals like accent that signalled belonging to the nation were not only understood in relation to norms of whiteness, but also tended to be naturalised onto white bodies in ways that they're not naturalised onto black and brown ones. This is something that Gaston Hage has talked about in the Australian context, and which is symptomatic of the kind of ingrained, historically constructed connection between Britishness and whiteness in the UK. So a normative link between Britishness and whiteness also meant that the cultural markers and normative framework of Britishness that people were working with, and within which people supposedly born and bred were expected to fit, was all marked by whiteness. This had clear implications for British people of colour, for whom a recognised belonging to the nation came to rely on, yes, on upbringing and culture, but within that, on their ability to inhabit whiteness, since it was this kind of proximity to whiteness that made their British upbringing legible in the eyes of white Britons. This kind of issue around race and whiteness is one that I delve into much more deeply in another article that I've published on the significance of race and whiteness in post-colonial, but also post-racial Britain. And that paper goes through looking more closely at some of the things people said around accent, around behaviours and values and dress, and looking at those things as racialised markers of Britishness to kind of demonstrate the ways that whiteness shapes and underpins conceptions of Britishness, even as individual people of colour and people of colour as a group are recognised as British. So that's a separate paper. Another paper that kind of links to this, this idea, but it's the flip side of it, I guess, is one in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, which looks at the significance of or insignificance of citizenship. So rather than, whereas the previous one looked at informal markers of national belonging, this one looks at formal markers of belonging and the extent to which that's meaningful in the kind of imaginings of white British middle class people that I was speaking to. Sorry, that's a bit of a detour, but I wanted to illustrate that there's a bit more to that. So going back to these three constructions of national belonging, the third construction, which I talk about as belonging as British, was based on ideas of ancestry and genetics, and reserved for bodies recognised as part of what Catherine Nash refers to as the genealogical community of shared descent. So in this construction, the cultural markers of belonging to Britain in terms of upbringing become marginalised, and corporeal whiteness becomes much more salient. So the quote up there is Paul, who described himself as a native Briton, Englishman and European, and claimed autochthonous belonging based on the idea that his ancestors have always been here. And he says that his ancestors didn't come here 2 generations ago, but have always been here probably since the last ice age. So when he said this, I laughed at the idea that Paul could trace his family back to the last ice age. So I assumed he was kind of exaggerating for effect. But he asserted that based on my appearance, the same could be said for me, and very seriously sort of showed that ancestry and for him, by association, autochthonous belonging was red from the skin. So for Paul, the national us was limited to white bodies, and he justified this exclusive construction of the nation through a language of ancestral presence, building on discourses of European indigeneity and ancient Britons. Elsewhere, he distinguished between white people whose history is kind of here and black and brown people whose history lies elsewhere. So here he says, they talk about we, us, our British, and they mean everyone. And I say, no, bullshit. When I listen to the radio and they talk about our history, our culture, our ancestors, I think, well, whose history? Not the woman in the burqa or that black guy, that's not his history. No matter how nice he is, that's not his history. So this is a really, I find it quite a powerful, albeit very offensive quote, but it clearly shows the way that for Paul, these genealogical narratives were not just about rooting himself in the nation, but about rooting himself over other people. And in Paul's case, this kind of genealogically informed logic of belonging, developing from ancestral presence, was used to exclude or at least marginalise the British-born children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren of migrants within a national hierarchy of belonging. He kind of recognised that people were living in Britain and could kind of belong there in some senses, but he couldn't see them as being kind of Britain or belonging as really or authentically British. And for him, they were positioned firmly outside of any kind of native national figure. This quote also clearly reveals the imaginary of a previously pure and homogenous white Britain, of which Paul's ancestors were part. And the mutually exclusive nature of these different histories, despite the historical connections between them, not least as a result of British imperialism. So people not recognised as part of the national community or genealogical community are seen to have no natural place in the nation. This is something Catherine Nash has talked about. And their exclusion or lower position within a hierarchy of belonging is justified on the basis of this non-relatedness. While Paul was explicit about the role of race when I talked to him, Rob, another participant, articulated racialised understandings more implicitly through a logic of genetics. And this allowed him to construct an idea of Britishness as inclusive of white people from the old Commonwealth, but still exclusive of darker-skinned people from the new Commonwealth. Here, for example, he talks about famous people born in India, how they're not really Indian, that's just where they were born, which is a physical thing rather than a genetic thing. And this is connecting into kind of ideas and language around a national family tree, which allows whiteness to be privileged without being named as white, while black and brown bodies are seen as genetically non-British. And in this genetic view, nationhood could only change over several generations of mixing, if that. So it really does have the power to be very, very exclusive in the way Rob and others might be thinking about it. For Rob, British imperial emigration represented little more than a blip in a much longer history. And when it came to colonial settlers, Rob explained that he would understand them as moving back to Britain because, to quote him, here in England is their country, they've only just briefly moved over there. So illustrating this in relation to some of his cousins who had moved to Rhodesia, Rob explained that, in my opinion, they are British because they look British and their DNA is completely 100% British. So if they then moved back to the UK and they get a British passport, yeah, in my opinion, they could be considered British. So here again, imperial British emigrants were constructed as kind of kith and kin, exported ethnic nationals and positioned as part of the nation kind of more authentically so, despite their birthplace, remoteness and lack of ties to the nation as a place. There are lots more things I could go into with these ideas, but given the time, I think I'll just move on to kind of a bit of an overview. So to summarise, in implicitly and explicitly distinguishing between these three different types of belonging, participants' narratives, when I spoke to them, kind of revealed differential hierarchies of national belonging. So belonging in Britain was open to non-British migrants and provided that they were integrated with local communities and kind of fit with local place norms. Belonging to Britain was attained through a perception of upbringing, and culture, providing opportunities for differently racialised Britons to be recognised as belonging to Britain, provided they fit with those ideas of British culture. And finally, this idea of belonging as British or being of Britain was about being part of the genealogical nation, which is obviously much more exclusive. So together, these three constructions of national belonging reveal both possibilities for and limits to national belonging, and the three of them work together in different ways. And it was clear that migrants and ethnically minoritised Britons could be and often were recognised as belonging in and to Britain, but they were rarely considered of Britain in the sense of being part of the genealogical nation. Meanwhile, white British people were commonly recognised not only as belonging in and to Britain, but also as being of Britain. Their place in national space was naturalised, and as part of the genealogical community of shared descent, they are also seen as being generative of nationhood in ways that British people of colour were not. So on the face of it, these three constructions of belonging seem to relate to respectively to the sort of civic, ethnocultural and genetic dimensions of nation, and have different temporal bases for membership, varying according to the length or period of residence. Some of that being read through racialised ideas about behaviour, culture and accent, but also according to heritage and descent. However, the analysis, when you sort of look into it and the logics that are underpinning these constructions of belonging, you see that the factors through which at least the latter two are being read and recognised by white middle class British people were all about kind of proximity or distance in relation to whiteness. And given these differing connections to whiteness and the different lengths of time involved in these various constructions, I think both of those things together mean that we can see them as hierarchical, with belonging as carrying the most weight. They're also hierarchical in terms of their permeability, the genealogical and genetic boundaries being, to use Nandita Sharma's phrasing, nearly impossible to cross. So, why does all of this matter? Well, while alternative belongings are possible, and migrants and minoritised Britons are by no means passive in relation to hierarchies of belonging, their elective belongings do need to be considered in relation to the wider context of their ability to belong and to be recognised and included as such by people whose belonging is more privileged. With their varying connections to whiteness, temporality and authenticity, the constructions of belonging that I've presented do appear to be hierarchical. And this does have important implications for the experience and belonging of migrants and racialised minorities. Recognising the belongings as hierarchical is also important because without an appreciation of that hierarchisation, the people who are being included within more dominant constructions of nationhood may appear, no, sorry, I got that backwards. Those excluded within more dominant constructions of nationhood may appear included. So if you're seeing people as belonging in Britain, you may miss the fact that they're actually being excluded from the other two more kind of higher up the hierarchy forms of belonging. And in this sense, there's an important kind of spatial and scalar dimension to hierarchies of belonging, which is worth exploring and thinking about more, I think. So assertions of inclusive belonging at one scale, for example, of belonging in Britain or belonging locally or to a region, may actually be enabling and perpetuating exclusive hierarchies at another. And this echoes the inclusivist pretensions, to use a phrase that Robbie Shilliam uses, of early British citizenship, which included colonial and Commonwealth citizens within Britishness while sustaining Englishness as white. So migrants and minorities are discursively constructed as being able to belong in Britain's towns and cities, but may nonetheless be marginalised in relation to the nation. So where you're collapsing the local and the national belongings together, it can produce an illusion of inclusion that's actually having the potential to kind of distract attention away from more exclusive constructions of belonging. Okay, so that was kind of what I wanted to say about that. Just to finish, I wanted to think about, or just sort of mention what I'm thinking about doing next or what I'm working on at the moment. And that's really trying to develop the last construction of belonging that I talked about, this kind of genealogically based ideas about belonging and indigeneity, autochthony. So I've got a paper that's hopefully going to be published fairly soon in the Journal of Sociology, exploring this in more detail, some of these narratives, these exclusive constructions of belonging, focusing particularly on Rob and Paul, who I talked about here. And in that paper, I'm trying to combine the frameworks of boundaries and hierarchies of belonging with existing literature on genealogical communities to show the benefit of thinking about them in that way. And all of this being connected in with narratives around nationhood and place-based belonging. And yeah, so, and then the idea is to kind of develop that further through research with genealogical communities and thinking about how engagement and thinking around those types of practices can shape understandings of belonging at a national scale, but also at local and regional scales, and how all of those things might be working together in the sort of ways that I was just talking about. Okay, so I think that's everything I was going to say. Thank you very much for coming and for listening. And if anyone's got any comments or feedback, you obviously can ask it in the questions, but I've also put my email address there, and I really welcome kind of people getting in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. That was fantastic. It was really interesting. Okay, quick reminder for questions. If you have one, turn on your camera. I can come to you. You can then turn on your microphone. If anyone wants to kick off, let's go for it. And then otherwise, we'll try and group questions after the first one. Marco, is that you having a question to kick us off?
Yeah, that's correct. Amy, I like very much the way you distinguish belonging in the nation and belonging to the nation. I find it very productive. And I wonder, because you mentioned at the beginning, there was a gap in the literature. And if I think about Skye, I wonder whether you see this as your own added value to the contribution. You see something else in relation to what Michael Skye has done, obviously, quite a lot in his research with this group. But sorry, this is just one. There are quite many points. I will try to be brief. So the second one, I was a bit surprised because you basically pull together migrants and racialized minorities, right? So British people, non-white. And that's a bit me confusing. Is it the participants that make that pulling together, or is it you? So can you elaborate a bit more on this point? And another one also is the dimension of class. And I might maybe didn't capture, but I don't think you mentioned class. You mentioned something. So use proxies like behavior, dress, accent. But I wonder whether you can elaborate more on the salience of class. Does it really make a major difference in the participants in terms of accepting, in terms of moving up, in terms of the hierarchy of belonging? And then I'm thinking about the last point. Last point is actually very much of what happened in this country. If I look at the home secretaries, these are the people that basically are in charge of defining the boundaries of belonging, legally, but partially also symbolically. Sajid Javid, Priti Patel, Swela Braverman, they're all non-white. Now, I'm conscious that you just want to capture only the white people, but I wonder here there is a risk, and I think we need maybe to be careful not to exaggerate the sort of monopoly or the sort of privilege entitlement that the white British have in terms of narrating the nation, because particularly the British nation is much, much, much more diverse and also in position of powers. And so who belongs or not, who doesn't belong, again, it should be, again, I'm conscious it's not your word, but I guess it should be better put as a caveat that this nation is very much a diverse nation. There are so many voices of who belong, who does not belong, and we should not confine it only to what possibly might be regarded as a privileged group by pointing down. So yeah, these are the points, but yeah, very, very much appreciate your talk. Thanks, Amy.
Okay, right. I've written those down, so hopefully I will get to all of them. The first thing was about, or where it's adding to Michael Skay's work and the difference between kind of belonging in and belonging to. Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I was coming at all of this from a migration studies perspective. So where I was kind of adding was trying to highlight a bit more, whereas Michael Skay sort of talks about white middle class people and how they reproduce the nation and you know, their normativity and the taken for grantedness of their belonging. I spoke to people a lot about their identities and their feelings about the nation, but what I really wanted to get at was how they were talking about and constructing other people. So it was very much like an outward focus from white British narratives, and I guess that's where I kind of see the added value of what I was trying to do was really about the construction of the other, which was more implicit in my conversations when I was doing the interviews, partly why I ended up doing multiple interviews with people, because I kind of needed a lot of data to try and unpick and see the complexity and contradictions that everybody, well, maybe not everybody, but that many of the participants had. So yeah, I think that was where I kind of saw my added value, and that ties a bit into the last thing you were talking about in terms of the country being really diverse. And yes, it is really diverse, and it's certainly not the case, and I hope this didn't come across, that white people are the only people with power in this thing. It is obviously more complicated, and class does come into that as well, in terms of it's the normativity of the white middle classes and the fact that, you know, they're often not examined in literature, which was why I wanted to focus on that. There is a small body of work, it's not massive, but on kind of the way that hierarchies of belonging are negotiated and worked out by other groups, migrant groups and racially minoritised Britons, so both of those groups, including kind of the work that EU migrants have done. I can't remember who did that off the top of my head, but in terms of how people might negotiate themselves or place themselves differently in relation to other minoritised groups to sort of stake their own claims for belonging, they position other people as lower than them within hierarchies. So there is some other work that focuses on those sort of processes. So again, what I was trying to do was really draw attention to a group that hadn't been looked at in as much detail, and trying to shed a bit of light on that. In terms of my use of the phrases, you know, because I do often kind of put them together, migrants and racially minoritised Britons or racialised minorities. Yes, they are different and they definitely don't overlap. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But I think it's probably a combination of participants treating them interchangeably, not in all cases, but often kind of treating them interchangeably, maybe because they don't actually know where people are coming from, or because racially minoritised Britons are often thought of in some way in relation to migration, whether it's in terms of, you know, the kind of problematic use of the second generation type narratives, or that they're just assumed to be from elsewhere. But in the context of my audit, useful to think about both groups in relation to these. I'm just thinking, I think I find it useful to think about both groups in terms of these processes of belonging, but they do fit differently within them. But then there are differences in terms of who the migrants are, what they look like, which countries they come from. They might be treated differently, more or less favourably than racialised Britons. And I think it's the complexity of the hierarchies that makes it difficult to see how it's very kind of individual on different groups of migrants and differently racialised minorities.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, I think we should give space to other people, otherwise I monopolise here the QA.
Okay, I can also just say the last thing about class in terms of its salience. to national belonging. I think class fits really, and I didn't get into it, I think it fits when I'm talking about the role that whiteness plays in kind of a normalised view of Britishness, and people having to fit with ideas of whiteness. For middle class white people, if it's a white middle class type culture that they would be imagining, and certainly class privilege would help people to be seen as British. But I think there's something about you know, where people are very perhaps of a higher class or kind of aristocracy from other countries, that's not going to help them to be seen as British. It's more the normativity, I think, the middle classness that for middle class people seems to be particularly powerful.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amy. Yeah, thanks.
Is there anyone else with a possible question or thought, comment? I'm happy to go. Let me turn my camera on. Hi. Yeah, thanks again, Amy. That was really interesting. I'm going to try and formulate a question, but maybe it's just an observation in the end. You mentioned the danger of sort of collapsing local and national hierarchies potentially. And I was interested in where you located your study, I guess, on the outskirts of North London. And potentially you might not have seen this within your particular area, but I was really interested in sort of the emphasis of the local, particularly in your sort of section on belonging to Britain, and your interviewers identifying locals who worked in the shops or owned businesses nearby as part of the community. I wonder whether there was much emphasis on the youth demographic within the area. I guess I'm conscious of London being a city where the younger demographic are often bound or territorialized by either postcodes or a north-south divide, and whether there was much awareness of that within the study or among the interviewers within the white middle class demographic, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think, I mean, it doesn't seem very young really, but the youngest person I spoke to was 32. So I didn't get much of a young demographic except via people talking about their children. And I'm not sure that anything to do with sort of postcodes or north, south of the river type stuff came up, but people did talk about kind of the ethnic change that they perceived in the area and how the area had got more diverse over the years. And it's partly why I chose that area. Well, it's an area that I know because I grew up there, but it's also an area that's experienced quite a lot of change, and it stretches out over, just put the map up maybe, it stretches, where I did the research, I had it stretching from kind of London out into Essex, where the demographics kind of, it did get a lot more white and the foreign born population dropped quite a lot. So I did get a kind of a spectrum of diversity and percentage of migrant population from that. When people talked about young people, besides a minority of people who saw it problematic that the area was more diverse and didn't look like how it used to look, that was definitely a minority of people. There were people who were very keen on the diversity and the benefits that it brought to their children in terms of like getting to know lots of different people, and they could see the benefits of that, and that was often used to kind of support positive narratives about Britain as a nation, as being inclusive and somewhere where everyone could be British, and the fact that Britishness was exciting and changing. So that was definitely something people sort of talked about. And then there were some kind of, I wouldn't call it concern, but sort of interest in a few of the interviews about how that sort of mixture and coming together and togetherness changed as people went through their schooling, so that by the time people were in secondary school and coming out of secondary school, groups had often formed along kind of ethnic lines, and that was something that people had a lot of curiosity around, but not necessarily kind of opinions on, I think.
Great, thank you. Oh, yes. Kirsty.
Hello, Amy. Nice to see you.
Oh, nice to see you.
Probably a predictable question for me, but I wondered if there was much gender difference in the way that the changes were perceived.
Yeah, I think trying to sort of think about that, because it's not so much, I haven't really focused as much on the gender dynamics. The more explicitly exclusionary constructions of belonging were all associated with the male participants, but they were a minority, so I couldn't say they were like representative in any way or generalize from that. But that was noticeable, I think, at that end, that more extreme end of how people saw other people as British or not. Yeah, no, I'm not sure I have a good answer for that at the moment. I should do. It's been a while since I looked at all the data, and the writing and things kind of focused more on class and race. But yeah, it's a really good question that I should be better at answering.
It's useful to get some sort of reflection, just thinking about who tends to stay local and who might travel beyond. And
yeah, I think one of the things that, and this, women talked a lot more about kind of families and relationships and their children and their families, whereas men were more likely to speak. But this all feels like gender stereotypes, so I'm a bit reluctant to go down it, but to sort of talk in a more abstract sense about the nation, and maybe to bring in, you know, conspiracy theories and like macro political things, whereas women were more focused on the sort of everyday, you know, the sort of, in fact, I think in this one, all of those, the ones that were talking about the local level and local people and the importance of that for how they understood belonging, those were all women. So yeah, there might be something there actually, but I haven't looked into that. It's interesting. Thank you.
Hi, Marco. You got your hand up again?
Apologies. I'm taking the second round just because I don't see any other questions. But it would be interesting. Also, interesting. I don't know what you make, but obviously, the question about what happened over the summer, right? And I wonder how you make it in relation to your own analytical framework when you look at belonging in, belonging to, belonging us. Whether you think actually yes, I have a confirmation that that scheme actually works, because you know these people are here, they are inside the space of the nation, but they are not considered as British, and so yeah, it works perfectly. I wonder whether you have reflected on what happened over the summer in relation to the data that you have, but you have any other consideration?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't considered it specifically in relation to the individual interviews and the data, but I think it was a very strong kind of sense that people who you could tell who felt it kind of came from two angles. I guess it supported a lot of the literature around the way that ethnically minoritized Britons and migrants, particularly migrants of colour, experience exclusion and marginalisation from kind of a feeling of feeling kind of fully belonging and accepted in the country. I think that came through quite strongly in the way that people felt those communities felt at that time. So you've got it from that angle, and I think that kind of supports the ideas around, you know, that they might be included at some levels, but they don't feel included or feel that they belong at all levels. And similarly, for the people who were on the other side, kind of, I'm not going to say protesting, but yeah, rioting and kind of articulating those exclusions, it was clear that they didn't see people as belonging probably in any of these ways, but certainly not in the two that were more linked to the nation, and that there's this very strong idea about who is really belonging to the nation, who is kind of at the top of the hierarchy, and it links in with all that stuff about kind of who feels entitled to have a say over the country. So that's definitely there. I think the other thing over the summer was obviously the counter protests and the people who went to kind of stand up against the far right across the country, and I think that also is supported very much in my data. Perhaps not, it doesn't fit quite so well with these constructions of belonging, but it was very evident in my interviews how strong the discourse is around Britain being inclusive and accepting was, and I think that is generally something very strong that people say and that people do feel and want to feel. I think where my research kind of adds to that or kind of problematizes that slightly is that in the way that people go about their lives and sort of act and think on an everyday level, there are ways where other Britons are positioned as slightly lower down the hierarchy, often in ways that are quite subtle and implicit, and that people wouldn't want to be part of reproducing. And I think there's an involvement there in kind of reproducing the nation as exclusive in some ways that the people doing it would like to think that they're not doing. And that's kind of a bit of a twist on that, I guess.
Yeah, thank you.
I think something went wrong there. Did that happen for everyone or just me?
Just you, I think.
Apologies, it cut out for a second.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, has anyone got any final comments? I think that's sort of near enough 5 o'clock, so maybe we should wrap up. Okay. Thanks once again, Amy, for your time, and to Marco, obviously, for facilitating and organising this. Our next LUNN talk, our last of the year, is by Jan Willem Duivendak from the University of Amsterdam, discussing the return of the native on the 11th of December at 4 p.m. Please reach out via the website to be added to the mailing list, or if you'd like a reminder. So thank you, and we'll see you next time. Amy, if you'd like to just stay behind for a couple of minutes, that would be great. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.